evening. Thank you to the Green Bus for inviting me to speak tonight. Thank you also for the introduction, Simon. I'm working in a consultancy called Focusright. We founded the consultancy 3 years ago with a former colleague of mine. We have both worked for over 10 years in private sector within corporate responsibility departments. So our work is guided by the so-called UNGPs, which I guess you're all familiar with, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And also, of course, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which are aligned with the UNGPs. So we're using this internationally accepted and pragmatic framework for introducing responsible conduct together with our clients. So as you know, the Responsible Business Initiative is asking for the introduction of mandatory due diligence and asking for translating this requirement into the Swiss law. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm also taking this opportunity tonight to focus on what due diligence really means to the companies. What does it mean to implement due diligence, rather than focusing on the legal aspects of liability. Through the work with our clients in a variety of sectors and sizes of companies and projects, we had the opportunity to help establish and implement due diligence processes in companies. I'll share some information on the current state of implementation, the challenges and the opportunities for the companies that are involved when introducing due diligence processes. I haven't taken any slides with me for tonight. I'm just going to share some inputs in this way. So on the current state of implementation, I'm going to refer to a project we are involved in Germany, which is called the NAP monitoring. So it's a monitoring of the German National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. Focusright is part of the consortium with 4 companies where we are actually implementing a monitoring system to assess whether German companies have adequately implemented human rights due diligence. The results have been published recently, so you might have seen or you might be aware of this process. When we developed this methodology 2 years ago, so there was like 2 years of surveys which we conducted with German companies, you can imagine that the challenge was in actually defining what is good enough to call adequate due diligence. So we know due diligence is about process, it's about assessing risks, taking measures, creating transparency. But when is due diligence enough for a company? And I think that's where we had very interesting debates, and it became also, of course, very political. The results clearly show that for a systematic due diligence, German companies have not scored very well. So we are at 13 to 17% of German companies with more than 500 employees who, according to this survey, have adequately implemented due diligence requirements. So then, of course, the question comes up, why do companies still struggle in implementing systematic due diligence, if knowing that many have been working on corporate responsibility for quite some years? So when we looked at this NAP monitoring in Germany, but also in our work with our clients, we identified 2 key challenges that companies are still facing, which is, in the first place, the change in perspective regarding the risk assessment, the human rights or environmental risk assessments they're conducting. So traditionally, the focus has been very much on the tier 1, like direct suppliers. The UNGPs are asking companies to have the whole value chain in mind when assessing the risks. So there is a clear expectation that you look at, like in a life cycle assessment, like in an environmental life cycle assessment, you look at the whole value chain, you assess specific risks that might, or impacts that might occur, and then there is also some guidance on how to prioritize those risks systematically with a specific focus on the people that are affected. So in Germany, the reason why companies scored rather badly on the risk assessment part was because they were not considering the entire value chain. Mostly they were focusing on their own operations and their first-tier suppliers. Then the second challenge is the companies have not systematically taken risk-based measures. So it's of course linked to the first challenge. If you have not taken or assessed your risks systematically, the measures you're taking will also be less systematic. So there are many companies who already have a lot of measures taken. In my experience, sometimes maybe even too many measures, which they could actually reduce if it was more focused, and I will talk about this just now. So in turning to the opportunities that we see when working with companies on due diligence. So we have kind of four kind of opportunities we observe. So the first one is that human rights due diligence or environmental due diligence, in line with the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines, focus really on the process that companies have, not the results. So what kind of processes do you implement in order to prevent the impacts, and how do you actually prioritize those processes that you have? A friend of mine recently told me that this resembles somehow the COVID concepts that we are all developing now. So I actually like the comparison. If a restaurant, let's say a restaurant, develops a COVID concept today, the manager of the restaurant has to first think about where are the risks of infection in the specific location. So where do people potentially get infected? And then you take the measures accordingly and you implement the process. You make sure your employees and your clients understand it. They abide to the rules. However, even though you have a good and adequate concept, you might still have infections in your operation, in your restaurant. So it's not about 100% security that nothing will happen. So that's the same with the human rights or the environmental due diligence. You can do your utmost to prevent impacts from happening, but even the most appropriate due diligence, you might still encounter problems in your value chain. And I think this just reflects the reality of our global value chains. So also the next opportunity when talking about not necessarily have a total control of your value chain, but you're actually trying to prioritize. And if you see that you have specific issues linked somewhere in your value chain, you start collaborating. You start dialogue with your suppliers or your business partners, and or with the industry, and you start acknowledging the issue and you try to find appropriate measures. So that's what the due diligence is all about. Third opportunity we see is the prioritization. There is quite a clear guidance on how severity of potential impacts are identified, like the most severe, and how the severity is assessed of potential impacts. So let's say if you have like abusive child labor where it really impacts the health of the children and they have long-term health problems in your value chain, you would rate this as more severe than if there is a factory in your supply chain where once a year they do not have their weekly rest day. So that's just the way you actually try to prioritize regarding the impact on the people and identifying the most severe impacts. And last but not least, for the opportunities, we are seeing a lot of sector initiatives that come up. They came up lately, and that's also a tendency that came up because companies were acknowledging that they have issues in the downstream or upstream value chain, but they recognize that they have limited leverage. They might, instead of trying to control the entire value chain, which is anyways not realistic for big companies, they will decide to engage with the sector and to increase the leverage together with others. So we have the example of the Swiss platform for sustainable cacao, where the chocolate producers came together to work on rendering the supply chain more sustainable. Or we have the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles in Germany. We have other initiatives like Amphori, which has been mentioned today already, where companies, also SMEs, engage to collaborate with others to improve the situation. So just to conclude, I think due diligence is the new state-of-the-art of CSR. It is guided by internationally harmonized and accepted frameworks. the overall goal should not be forgotten. The overall goal is really to improve the situation of the people involved or affected in the global value chains we have. And important also to remember that the focus is on the most severe issues. If you introduce your due diligence, it's about prevention rather than reaction. So the primary objective is really to prevent impacts from happening. It's also about constructive dialogue rather than total control. So it's about strengthening relationships with business partners. It's also about company-specific measures. So it's embedded in existing processes. We have seen this today already in the examples. And it should not be seen as a box-ticking administrative exercise. So if you embed it well, you will also be able to prove that you have the processes that are embedded in your business. And last but not least, when talking about potential litigation, we have to remember that this would only come into play as a last resort. So it would come into play when the due diligence didn't work, when there was no agreement found with the affected parties. And we have to assume that before it actually comes to a Swiss court, the companies will have the opportunity to engage with the people affected and to try to find solutions. So most probably it will not come as a surprise once a Swiss court is responsible for judging on the issue, and the companies will have a history to prove that they have tried to engage and that no agreement has been found, even though due diligence was implemented. So I'm conscious of time, and I will stop at this stage, and I will thank you for your attention and look forward to the debates afterwards.